right, well, I'm very glad to be here again after my visit last year. Before I begin, I want to make a couple of thank yous. I want to thank Mr. John Grady, who's the former editor of the Navy Times. Mr. Grady has just written a new comprehensive biography on Commander Maury. He and I have made contact through some friends in the Navy, and he's aware of my work on what I call the Pathfinder Papers. He has some of his cards there if anyone's interested in contacting him about his new book. I also want to thank Howard Cohen of the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. That's our nation's intelligence branch that deals with charting and mapping and tracking. And because of that, the NGA traces a great deal of its history back directly to Commander Maury. And Mauri Hall on their compound outside Washington, D.C. is named in honor of Commander Maury. And Mr. Cohen has studied Commander Maury for decades and has written several things about him, and he's been nice enough to let me hand out one of his articles about Commander Maury you can take with you when you leave. I also want to thank Ed Gent. He's the project manager of the new USNS Maury, the TAGS 66, which is the newest vessel in the Pathfinder fleet in the U.S. Navy, which is named in honor of Commander Maury, as he's known as the Pathfinder of the Seas. That's our Navy's oceanographic survey vessels. Mr. Gent also sent me some information last week that you can take home with you about the Maury. I also want to thank the Fontaine Maury Society, specifically Dr. Hubert McAlexander, who's become a good friend of mine. Dr. Mac is, as he's known to his friends, is a Fontaine Maury descendant. He was nominated for a Pulitzer for his biography of Peter Taylor in 2002. They just named part of the Ole Miss English department in honor of Dr. Mack. He's been a large supporter of me in my continuing work and research on Commander Maury. As I start out, my passion for Maury came quite by chance. Several years ago, I read Shelby Foote's epic masterpiece, The Civil War, a Narrative. It's a 3,000-page epic. And on a couple of pages in his book, he discussed the Css Alabama, which was a British-built Confederate commerce raider that had a famous duel with the USS Kearsarge in June of 1864 off the coast of France. And for some reason, that story of the Css Alabama and Great Britain's involvement with the Confederacy in the American Civil War piqued my interest. So I read Admiral Raphael Sims' Memoirs. Admiral Sims was the captain of the Css Alabama. And all through his memoirs, he kept talking about Maury from Tennessee, this great friend of his, Commander Maury from Tennessee. So of course I had to look into this, and I Googled it and looked it up on Wikipedia. And lo and behold, I found out that Commander Matthew Fontaine Maury grew up right here in Franklin, Tennessee, which floored me because I was born and raised here and I had never heard of this man. So I read everything I could get my hands on about Commander Maury. And I was shocked to learn that Battleground Academy was founded in his honor, and that there's a plaque that the DAR had placed at the entrance to the Williamson County Archives that honors Williamson County's favorite son, Commander Matthew Fontaine Maury. I was shocked that there's a 1939 Academy Award nominated short film about Commander Maury called Prophet Without Honor. And last but not least, that there's an entire fleet of Navy ships named in his honor. So in that vein, I began to collect letters of Commander Maury's. And long story short, these letters obviously were not held in museums or universities. Over the last several years, I've collected the largest amount of Commander Maury's letters and papers held in private hands. And I call this the Pathfinder Papers. And the unique thing about my collection is that I have been the first person to ever go through these particular papers of Commander Maury's. So it's a tremendous portion of his history that has been yet to discover. So I'm going through it, pulling the history from it, and hopefully would like to tell a fuller story of this remarkable man's life. And so I'll begin. And before I get into it, obviously this man's life is so extensive I can't get into every part of it. So I'm going to focus mostly on his career. He was a wonderful family man, happily married, many children, but I don't have time to get into that this evening. This is Commander Maury's bust in the Hall of Fame of Great Americans in New York City. He was inducted in the class of 1930 with President James Monroe and our nation's great poet Walt Whitman, Captain, oh my Captain. And on that occasion, one of Mauri's biographers, Mr. John Wayland, had the following to say: "The thing that made Matthew Maury a great man was his ability to see the invisible. He saw the transatlantic cable before it was laid. He saw a great training school for our naval officers and weather reports for our farmers long before either was a reality. He was a seer and a pathfinder, not only on the seas, but under the seas, across the lands and among the stars." Matthew Maury was born on January 14th, 1806 in Spotsylvania, Virginia. He was the son of Richard and Diana Maury, and he was the grandson of the Reverend James Maury. Now, his grandfather, Reverend Maury, ran a classical school for boys outside Charlottesville, Virginia in the mid-1700s. And Reverend Maury had three quite famous young students, and they were James Madison, James Monroe, and young Thomas Jefferson. And in his recent biography on Thomas Jefferson, Pulitzer Prize-winning historian John Meacham had the following to say about Reverend Maury's lasting impact on Thomas Jefferson. He said, "Thomas Jefferson boarded with the Reverend James Maury, whom Jefferson described as a correct classical scholar. Maury did splendidly by Jefferson, grounding him in the classics and giving him a sense of order." So needless to say, Matthew Fontaine Maury was born into a family of both great faith and great minds. And this is a historic marker located along the Gordonsville Highway just outside Keswick, Virginia, that honors both the Reverend James Maury and his grandson, Commander Matthew Fontaine Maury. Now, in 1811, Matthew's father, Richard, had grown tired of raising tobacco in Virginia. And so Richard Maury decided to move his family west into Tennessee, where he would join his first cousin, Abram Maury. And Abram Maury founded Franklin in 1799. Matthew Maury was 5 years old when he arrived here in Franklin, Tennessee. Now, his father, Richard, acquired some land, which is located off modern-day Blazer Road, which is about halfway between Leaper's Fork and Franklin. And there is a historic marker there now marking the Maury farm. Richard Maury built a log cabin, and he started to grow a new crop, cotton. Now, in order for Richard to finance the move from Virginia to Tennessee, he had had to sell most of his slaves. So therefore, with cotton being an intensive crop, he needed all hands in the field, especially all his children, including Matthew. So early on in his life, it appeared that Matthew Maury was destined to spend it behind a plow. Now, Richard Maury, like his own father, the Reverend Maury, was a man of deep faith, and he wanted to make sure he raised his children in an environment of faith. He told them of their French Huguenot history and the crises and suffering that their ancestors had during the revocation of the Edict of Nantes. And the Episcopal Church was not yet established in Tennessee, but Richard Maury made certain to read daily from the Episcopal Book of Prayer to his children. And one verse in particular which stuck with Matthew Maury was Psalm chapter 8, verse 8, "The fowl of the air and the fish of the seas, and whatsoever passes through the paths of the seas." That verse stuck with him from the time he was a boy. Now, in this young time in his life in Tennessee, there was tension between the father and the son. Matthew's father wanted the boy to learn to farm and how to run a plantation. But it became evident quite early that Matthew Maury had different plans. He had a passion to learn, especially for science. And one of Matthew Maury's first pulls towards science happened right here in Franklin, and he would later recall, "The first man of science I ever saw in my infant days in Franklin was a shoemaker, old Mr. Neal. He was a mathematician, and he worked out his problems on leather and would send home his shoes with their soles covered in little X's and Y's. The example of that man first awakened in my breast the young spirit of emulation." So young Matthew Maury explored the Franklin of his youth, and the waters of the Harpeth River were some of the very first to ever touch his soul. Now, at this point, I'd like to talk a little bit about Matthew's relationship with his elder cousin, Abram Maury. And that's Abram Maury. He's the father of Franklin. He founded Franklin in 1799. Unlike Matthew's own father, Abram saw things in the boy. And he saw that Matthew had a special spirit about him, and he had an insatiable desire to learn. Now, Abram owned the big plantation in town, Tree Lawn, and it was known that Matthew would often spend the night at Tree Lawn, where Abram had an extensive private library. And according to legend, Matthew Maury read every single book in Abram's library. And as a term of endearment, he called Abram Uncle Abram. So he read every single book in Uncle Abram's library he could find. Now in 1818, Matthew Maury suffered what would be the first of two accidents in his life, and each one would forever shift his path. He was 12 years old, and like most 12-year-old boys, he liked to climb trees. He was climbing a tree near his parents' home when he took a fall, by some accounts 40 feet. He almost bit his tongue clean off, and he damaged his back fairly badly, needless to say. Now, the doctors told his father that both would heal, but they also told his father that the boy could no longer work in his father's cotton fields. So it was at this point that Uncle Abram stepped into Matthew Maury's life in a big way. Abram Maury was the trustee of a school here in Franklin called the Harpeth Academy. And Abram convinced Richard Maury to let the boy attend Harpeth Academy. And Richard Maury was none too pleased with this, but he really didn't have a choice. So Matthew Maury entered the Harpeth Academy at the age of 12. His first headmaster at the Harpeth Academy was the Reverend Gideon Blackburn. And Reverend Blackburn was also Matthew Maury's first Latin teacher. And later in his life, Reverend Blackburn noted that young Matthew Maury appeared to get the grasp of Latin in only 7 school days, which shattered the Harpeth Academy record. Now, the good Reverend was probably exaggerating a bit, but nevertheless, it does show the aptitude for learning that Matthew Maury had. Now, when Reverend Gideon Blackburn left as headmaster of Harpeth Academy to pursue other endeavors, a young man replaced him by the name of James Hervey Odie. And when Odie took over as headmaster of Harpeth Academy, there was an immediate bond between Odie and young Matthew Maury, and the two men would maintain a lifelong friendship. And in the coming years, James Odie would found the Episcopal Diocese of Tennessee, and James Odie would become the first Episcopal Bishop of Tennessee, founding St. Paul's Episcopal Church just down the street here in Franklin. But Odie and Maury would remain lifelong friends, and even until their deaths, Matthew Maury referred to Odie as his preceptor, as his teacher. Now, in January of 1825, Uncle Abram Maury died, and it left a massive hole in Matthew Maury's life. Abram was one of his biggest supporters. And from that day forward, Matthew Maury told his cousins he was devoting his life to be a useful man each and every day in order to honor Abram Maury's memory. And so later that year, in the summer of 1825, Matthew Maury had made up his mind that, much against his father's wishes, he was going to leave Franklin and his family and join the United States Navy. And he received a letter of recommendation from a young Tennessee congressman who took a shine to young Maury, and that was Sam Houston. And Matthew's father was so against it, he gave him no money to make the trip to Washington, D.C., but thankfully Matthew had saved up $30 he had earned as a teacher's assistant at the Harpeth Academy. So in the summer of 1825, he left Franklin, but Maury would always remember what he would call his Tennessee school days when the air was filled with castles. Matthew Maury would spend roughly the next 9 years at sea on 3 primary cruises, and I'll go through each one briefly here. The first cruise was aboard the USS Brandywine, which was commissioned specifically to escort Revolutionary War hero, the French general, the Marquis de Lafayette, back to France following his grand tour of America the previous year. And like all midshipmen selected for the Brandywine, Midshipman Maury was selected because of his family's contributions during the Revolutionary War. His uncles James and Fontaine were both at the siege of Yorktown during the Virginia campaign, and his uncle Fontaine was an aide-de-camp to General Lafayette. Now, we know that Lafayette and young Matthew Maury spoke to each other during the cruise of the Brandywine. We don't know precisely what they said, but we do know that Lafayette took a shine to Matthew Maury and vice versa. Lafayette's personal motto was the Latin phrase cur non, which meant why not? Why not try something extraordinary? And it's emblazoned on Lafayette's family crest. When Lafayette himself was 19 years old, and coming to help the young Americans in their fight against the British, his friends in France asked him why. Why are you risking so much to help what in essence are considered these rebels in their fight against Great Britain that they're likely to lose? And Lafayette, feeling the cause was good and just, answered, "Kernan, why not? Why not try something great?" And later on we'll learn how we know Maury picked up on Lafayette's spirit. His next cruise was aboard the USS Vincennes. This would be a 4-year cruise. The USS Vincennes would be the first U.S. warship to ever circumnavigate the entire globe, and Matthew Maury was on it. It was also on the Vincennes that Maury began to become dissatisfied with the teachers they had in the Navy. They had teachers aboard these ships, but they did not reach the standard that Matthew and his young mates felt were worthy. And so Matthew Maury began what he called his self-education aboard the USS Vincennes. And he would later write, "I used to draw problems in spherical trigonometry with chalk on the shot and put them in the racks where I could see them as I walked the decks. That with so much perseverance I have failed in my prime object, I attribute to the lack of books and proper teachers in the United States Navy." So a seed was planted in young Maury's mind. His next cruise was aboard the USS Falmouth, and he was named sailing master or navigator of the Falmouth. And he navigated the Falmouth around Cape Horn, around the southern tip of South America, which are some of the most dangerous waters in the world. And prior to navigating the Falmouth around the Horn, young Maury searched for charts that other people perhaps had made that might help him plan his route, and he found nothing. So again, another seed was planted in young Maury's mind. In the summer of 1834, after almost 10 years, he returned to land in Boston. And he decided to write an article titled "On the Navigation of Cape Horn." And this article was published in the highly regarded American Journal of Sciences and Arts, and it was extremely well received beyond Maury's imagination. And so this encouraged the 28-year-old Matthew Maury to try his hand at his first book. And in 1836, Matthew Maury published a new theoretical and practical treatise on navigation. And this book would become the first book of nautical science ever published by an American naval officer. And on the title page, he had the words "Kernan" printed across it. It was his nod to the old French General Lafayette and an answer to those who doubted his abilities to write the book. They said he wasn't classically educated and he couldn't do it, but Kernan was his answer. One of the reviewers of Maury's practical navigation was Edgar Allan Poe, who was serving as editor of the Southern Literary Messenger in Richmond, Virginia at the time. And Poe was known to be a very tough critic, but he was very fond of Maury's work, and Poe wrote, "Through Matthew Maury, the spirit of literary improvement has been awakened among the officers of our gallant Navy. We are pleased to see that science also is gaining votaries from its ranks. The time is coming when, imbued with a taste for science and a spirit of research, they will become ardent explorers of the regions in which they sojourn." Now, in 1839, Matthew Maury suffered the second accident of his life that would forever shift his path. He had visited his parents here in Franklin while on leave and was making his way to New York City to begin work on a new coast survey. The accident took place on a rainy night in Ohio. Maury was riding on a stagecoach and was up top with the coachman. The stagecoach slipped off the path and Commander Maury was thrown to the ground. His right knee was completely dislocated and his right thigh bone was completely shattered. Within an instant, 33-year-old Matthew Maury's extended time at sea and dreams of exploring the world came to an abrupt end. His leg would never properly heal, and for the rest of his life, he would require, for the most part, the use of a cane. So the young man who so loved the sea was now bound to the land, And although he was devastated, he refused to let himself down. So he picked up his pen and he began to write a series of letters he titled "The Scraps from the Lucky Bag." And these letters were published in newspapers across the country. And he wrote them under a pen name, Harry Bluff. And he wrote under a pen name to try to avoid any political confrontations. But he wrote about the inefficiencies he'd seen in the Navy in his previous years of service, specifically the need for a naval academy. And Maury wrote in one of the letters, one of the scraps from the lucky bag, "There is not in America a naval school that deserves the name, or that pretends to teach more than the mere rudiments of navigation. Why are not steps taken to have our officers educated and fitted for this high responsibility? The idea of a United States Naval Academy has been ridiculed." In 1845, much to Maury's delight, the U.S. Naval Academy was founded and established. And although no one particular individual is responsible for its founding, and although the USS Somers event played a portion of its role, Maury's roar on the subject was a loud roar. And Mauri Hall today stands at Annapolis in his honor. And the yearbook for the Naval Academy is called "The Scraps from the Lucky Bag." And Captain Miles Duval, renowned U.S. Navy historian, even said, quote, "Matthew Maury's leadership was probably the single greatest factor in bringing about the creation of the United States Naval Academy." Not bad for the little boy that grew up here in Franklin. Now, in 1844, Matthew Maury was named as the first superintendent of the United States Naval Observatory, a position he would hold until the outbreak of the American Civil War. When he took control of the U.S. Naval Observatory, Commander Maury noticed thousands of old captain logs thrown in corners of the rooms. Now, most in the Navy viewed these captain logs as trash, and many wanted them burned and destroyed to make room. But Matthew Maury thought that these captain's logs might hold secrets. He remembered the lack of information he'd had when making his passage around Cape Horn. So Matthew Maury assembled his team at the Naval Observatory, and they began poring over these thousands of old captain's logs, and they began to develop charts. And these charts pulled the patterns from the chaos, and they began to have a distinct effect on the way the world traveled the oceans. Maury wrote of the wind and current charts. The primary object of the wind and current charts was to collect the experience of every navigator as to the winds and currents of the oceans, and that navigators hereafter, by consulting this chart, would have for their guide the results of the combined experiences of all. He never forgot Psalm chapter 8, verse 8, the paths of the sea. For Maury, if it was written in the Bible, even if we didn't understand it, to him that meant it was there for us to discover. And he set his life about that task. One of the greatest stories of the achievements of Maury's charts, in my opinion, is the story of the great clipper ship, the Flying Cloud. In the early 1850s, the sailing route from New York to San Francisco was critical because the gold rush was on, and time meant money. Prior to Maury's charts, the average sailing time from New York to San Francisco took anywhere from 150 to 130 days, and you had to go around Cape Horn to get there. Well, the navigator of the Flying Cloud was a woman, which at that time was extraordinary in and of itself, and she was an aggressive young woman named Eleanor Creasy, and she was from Marblehead, Massachusetts, and she was a disciple of Matthew Maury and his work at the Naval Observatory. And Eleanor Creasy convinced the owners of the Flying Cloud to allow her to use Matthew Maury's charts from the New York to San Francisco sailing route with the Flying Cloud, and the owners reluctantly agreed. The Flying Cloud in 1853 made the passage from New York to San Francisco not in 150 days, not in 130, but in 89 days. They shaved over a month off the average sailing time. And then, as now, time was money. And Mr. Maury was now very, very well known. The sailing record of the Flying Cloud stood for over 130 years and was not broken until 1989. It was an extraordinary achievement. And following the success of the Flying Cloud, Matthew Maury began to leverage the success of his charts on an international level. And in 1853, he organized a maritime meteorological conference in Brussels, Belgium, which was the first ever of its kind. And Maury spearheaded the entire thing. 10 nations met for 2 weeks in Brussels, and in the end, they agreed upon adopting a uniform system of recording and measuring data at sea. From that point forward, Matthew Fontaine Maury's charts would be carried on ships representing 3/4 of all seafaring nations. And Maury wrote of the success of the Brussels Conference. Though they may be enemies in all else, here they are friends. Every ship that navigates the high seas with these charts on board may henceforth be regarded as a floating observatory, a temple of science. And following the Brussels conference, the awards and honors began coming to young Matthew Maury. And at one point in our nation's history, Matthew Maury was the most decorated individual ever born on American soil. And this is a short list, a very short list of some of the knighthoods and honors that were bestowed upon Maury following the Brussels conference as honors, tokens of appreciation for his donations to society through his science. And one of the people that took note of Maury was one of the world's greatest scientists of all time, Baron Alexander von Humboldt. And to sort of express how massive Humboldt was, Thomas Jefferson once said, "I consider Baron Humboldt to be the most important scientist I have ever met." But Baron Humboldt declared that in his opinion, Matthew Maury had fathered a new science, which Humboldt called the physical geography of the sea. Today we call it oceanography. And in 1854, Baron Humboldt convinced Matthew Maury to write what Maury would later call his great work, and Maury titled it The Physical Geography of the Sea, in a nod to his mentor Baron Humboldt. And still today, Maury's Physical Geography of the Sea is considered the first comprehensive textbook ever written on the science of oceanography. In 1854, Matthew Maury was contacted by entrepreneur Cyrus Field. And Field asked Maury if he thought it was feasible to have a transatlantic cable. And Matthew Maury, in answer to Cyrus Field, showed him this chart. And according to the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, the world's premier mappers and trackers, this chart here is the first bathymetric or deep sea depth chart ever published of the ocean floor. And it was published by Commander Maury. And from this chart, Matthew Maury explained to Cyrus Field he believed there was a telegraphic plateau, he called it, stretching from Newfoundland to Ireland. And Matthew Maury said that he believed, quote, "This plateau seemed to have been placed here especially for the purpose of holding the wires of a submarine telegraph and of keeping them out of harm's way." So Matthew Maury and Cyrus Field worked on the first transatlantic cable for the next few years. And in 1858, the first transatlantic cable was laid. And after its initial success, there was a dinner in New York City celebrating the achievement. And Cyrus Field gave a toast in which he stated, "I did the work, England gave the money, but Matthew Maury furnished the brains." Now, in 1860, Matthew Maury's former teacher here in Franklin, who was now the first Episcopal Bishop of the state of Tennessee, Bishop James Odie, asked Matthew if he would give the cornerstone speech for a new university being established in Tennessee. And of course, Matthew Maury agreed to do so. And on October 10th, 1860, Matthew Maury delivered the cornerstone speech for the University of the South at Sewanee. And I'll read one excerpt that, in my opinion, embodies Maury's vision of his faith and science. "The Bible is true and science is true. They are both true. Thus, as we progress with our science, we are permitted to point out here and there in the physical machinery of the earth a design of the great architect when he planned it all." Now, in 1860, Matthew Maury, like the rest of the people in the country, felt our nation tumbling towards civil war. And as former Tennessee State historian Walter Durham wrote in his final book, which was about Commander Maury, Mr. Durham said that Maury was very much against secession in all manners. And so Maury reached out to friends in the North, specifically the governor of New Jersey and the governor of Pennsylvania, in the hopes that they could serve as mediators to help avoid war. That, of course, did not happen. Matthew Maury also reached out to his friend, William Giles Harding, the owner of the Belmead Plantation, to see if Mr. Harding could also help as a mediator. In January of 1861, Matthew Maury wrote William Giles Harding the following: "Divide us into two nations, and we shall have instead of one glorious nation, two half-breeds, dwarfed in size." But Matthew Maury also let William Giles Harding know where he would stand in case of war. that you may know where to find me in case I am wanted at the home of my youth. Turn to the story of Ruth in the Holy Bible. If Tennessee should get herself into trouble, remember that she and her people are always Naomi to me. And Matthew Maury also had two offers of asylum during the days leading up to the war, France and Russia. In fact, Tsar Alexander II offered Commander Maury the position of Supreme Scientist of Russia. He said Matthew Maury could bring his family to Russia. They could live in peace while his country fought its own civil war. He could continue his scientific pursuits in peace and could return to America anytime he wanted. Matthew Maury declined and said that his duty would rest with wherever the South chose to do. And we know what happened. On April 20th, 1861, Matthew Maury resigned his commission in the U.S. Navy and lent his services to the Confederate States, where he was named a commander. His first duty, he was named Chief of Seacoast, River, and Harbor Defenses. And in this vein, he began to develop electrically charged underwater torpedoes, which we call today mines. And according to the Smithsonian Institute, others before Maury had experimented with such devices, but Matthew Maury was the first American to use them successfully in battle. Their effectiveness was attested to by Secretary of the Navy Gideon Welles, who reported before Congress after the war that the Federal Navy lost more vessels from Confederate torpedoes than from all other causes combined. So now you know what Admiral Farragut was talking about when he stormed into the Battle of Mobile Bay and said, "Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead." Now, in 1862, Matthew Maury was sent to Europe on special assignment with the Confederate Secret Service. Now, Great Britain and France's involvement with the Confederacy during the Civil War and the Confederate Secret Service may be a part of the war that doesn't get discussed as much as other areas. But the recent CIA report called Intelligence in the Civil War, this excerpt from that report, sums it up quite concisely in my mind. The Confederacy decided they needed to build a navy that could sink Northern merchantmen. And lacking adequate shipyards, Confederate officials sent secret agents to both Britain and France for that purpose. So Commander Maury was an agent in France and in England, and his job was to procure ships that were built by France and Great Britain to serve the Confederacy. The Confederate Secret Service was headquartered in Liverpool, England, and was run by Teddy Roosevelt's uncle, James Bullock. And the reason it was headquartered in Liverpool was because of cotton. American cotton poured into Liverpool through the River Mersey. And from Liverpool, that cotton was transferred by rail to such textile towns as Bolton and Manchester. And Manchester, England, was even nicknamed Cottonopolis. And according to the great historian Amanda Foreman, whose book is wonderful, World on Fire, Great Britain's Involvement in the American Civil War, upwards of 5 million Brits were directly affected by Southern cotton. So it was a strange situation. Britain was very anti-slavery, but at the same time there was a strong Confederate support. They didn't want the economy to go into a recession if that cotton dried up. So Matthew Maury acquired the CSS Georgia for the Confederacy from Dumbarton, Scotland, and he placed his cousin William Lewis Maury in command of the CSS Georgia. The Georgia had some success, but the most famous of all the Confederate British-built commerce raiders was the CSS Alabama. The CSS Alabama, under command of Admiral Raphael Sims, took 65 prizes in its 2-year cruise. And a great portion of their success came because they used Maury's charts. And that's a picture of the Alabama, and a picture of Admiral Sims, who's seated, and Commander Maury, who's standing. That picture was taken in London sometime near the end of the war. The Alabama, by using Maury's charts to know exactly where to find Northern merchantmen, and on the other hand, knowing exactly where to hide, was so effective that New York businessman Cornelius Vanderbilt donated the flagship of his mail steamer fleet to the U.S. Navy to be outfitted as a warship, the USS Vanderbilt. And the USS Vanderbilt's primary goal was to seek and destroy the CSS Alabama. The Vanderbilt never saw the Alabama. The Alabama's fate would come in its duel with the USS Kearsarge. But following the war, Cornelius Vanderbilt made an initial endowment to a university here in Nashville, which is obviously Vanderbilt. And Cornelius hoped that Vanderbilt over the years would help mend the wounds caused by the Civil War. So Cornelius was a great man. In May of 1865, Matthew Maury learned of the collapse of the Confederacy. And because he had served as a foreign agent for the Confederacy, he was not initially pardoned. So he decided, through his friendship with Napoleon III, to accept the position of Imperial Commissioner of Colonization in the Second Mexican Empire. And it was in Mexico that Matthew Maury hoped to establish what he called the New Virginia colonies, which would be a place where disgruntled ex-Confederates could go and rebuild their lives. Maury's old friend, General Robert E. Lee, wrote Commander Maury about his thoughts on Maury's plans for Mexico. And Lee wrote, "Captain Maury, the citizens who can leave this country and the others who may be compelled to do so will reap the fruits of your considerate labors in Mexico. But I shall be very sorry if your presence be lost to Virginia and America. She has need for all her sons now, and she can ill afford to spare yours." Thankfully, Maury did not stay in Mexico long. The Second Mexican Empire crumbled and Maximilian I was executed. Maury returned to England as he was still not yet pardoned, and he began working for a New York publisher on a series of children's physical geography books, and he settled in London with his wife. In September of 1867, the second Episcopal Bishop of Tennessee, Bishop Charles Todd Quintard, made a trip to London, where he met with Commander Maury. And Bishop Quintard confirmed Maury into the Episcopal Church at St. Peter's in London. And during this same trip, as it became apparent that Andrew Johnson was going to pardon Maury, Quintard began to offer Maury the position of vice chancellorship at Sewanee, which is the equivalent of president. Quintard felt that Bishop Odie would have wanted this, and Bishop Odie had died during the Civil War. Maury respectfully declined the offer to lead Sewanee, and in 1868 he was pardoned by President Johnson, and he returned to the America that he loved. He was also offered the presidency of the University of Alabama and the University of Tennessee. He declined those as well, and he accepted the position of physics and meteorology at the Virginia Military Institute. And this is the Mauri House, located on the post at VMI. It's right along the parade ground. And this is where Commander Maury spent his final days. And his good friend, General Robert E. Lee, was right next door at Washington College, which is now Washington and Lee. The two universities literally run right next to each other. Commander Maury was known that General Lee was a frequent visitor at the Mauri House. In October of 1870, General Lee died, and Commander Maury was one of his pallbearers. It was during his time at VMI that Matthew Maury began a physical survey of Virginia, which was a survey conducted to tell the people of Virginia and guide them in how to rebuild after following the devastation caused by the American Civil War. And Maury thoroughly enjoyed this work. He also began to lecture again, both North and South. He was even invited to speak in Boston. And I know that this meant a great deal to Commander Maury as the wounds of the war began to heal. So he would travel north and south. And he began to talk about what he called a telegraphic meteorological bureau, which would be for farmers and would help give them consistent weather reports. And Maury's idea of a telegraphic meteorological bureau was the forerunner of the National Weather Service. In the winter of 1872, following a speech in St. Louis, Matthew Maury fell ill, and he returned to his home at VMI, where he died on February 1st, 1873. His final words to his family were the nautical term for calm seas: all is well. He's buried in President's Circle in Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, Virginia, between President John Tyler and President James Monroe. And on his tombstone are engraved the words, "all is well." Now, Maury's legacy is continued in many ways today. There's the Maury Project, which is a joint initiative between the U.S. Naval Academy and the American Meteorological Society. This is a joint educational initiative that promotes the continued study of the science of oceanography. But in my opinion, the greatest tribute to Maury's legacy is the Pathfinder class of U.S. Navy oceanographic survey vessels. And this is the newest vessel in the Navy's Pathfinder class. This is the USNS Mauri, the TAGS 66. It's the most advanced oceanographic survey vessel ever built. And this is a photo from last November through some friends of mine in the Navy and the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. A few of us received security clearance to go down to Pascagoula to VT Halter Marine to visit the USNS Mauri and to get a private tour. Pictured are Dr. Peter Ballinger. He's one of Mauri's descendants, and his daughter Brooke. In the middle, in the red shirt, is Captain Joseph Goodwin of the USNS Mauri. Captain Goodwin is currently on leave. He's enjoying some much-needed time with his family. But Captain Goodwin gave us a private tour that day. And we were not allowed to take photographs inside the vessel for obvious reasons, but I can tell you it is extraordinary. Its capabilities would absolutely astonish Commander Maury. One of the unique properties of the vessel is there's a moon pool beneath it that can launch what are called autonomous underwater vehicles very discreetly from prying eyes of any satellites and whatnot. These underwater vessels are sort of the equivalent of aerial drones, yet they are autonomous. So you can unleash them and they can explore the ocean floors and sort of make their own decisions. And you'll pick them up at a designated place. It's extraordinary. This is a photograph taken a couple of weeks ago. That's Mr. Ed Gint, who's the project manager of the USNS Mauri. He's stationed at the Naval Oceanographic Office at Stennis Space Center in Mississippi. And he's shaking the hand of Rear Admiral Timothy Gallaudet, who is the current Chief Oceanographer and Navigator of the United States Navy. The Mauri, the USNS Mauri, embarked on its maiden voyage just 2 weeks ago. And when we visited the vessel, I presented Captain Goodwin and the crew with an 1854 first edition of Commander Maury's Physical Geography of the Sea in my collection. And the night before we visited the ship, I had Commander Maury's great-grandson, George Carter Worth, sign the book. Captain Goodwin made it known that he wants the book displayed on the ship at all times to stand as a reminder to all aboard of Commander Maury's vision and spirit. And so, as I wrap up, I would like to end with a quote from Rear Admiral Jonathan White, who was the former Chief Oceanographer of the United States Navy, and what he said when he saw the USNS Mauri's launch. And I think of how far Matthew Maury came from those early days in the Harpeth River here in Franklin. But Rear Admiral Jonathan White said, if Matthew Fontaine Maury was here today to see this ship and to see the people who built it, he would say, all is well. And indeed, he would say, all is well. Thanks for coming out tonight. Well, I hope everybody enjoyed it. If you have any questions.
Well, obviously, my team would be a month. Have you ever spoken to them, or have you ever done anything?
I've been in touch with the colonel there. I can't think of his name off the top of my head. His great-grandson, George Carter Worth, who's still alive, he's in his 90s. George Carter's elder brother was Captain J. Mauri Worth, who, unbelievably, in the late 1960s and early 70s, also served as superintendent of the Naval Observatory, following in the footsteps of his great-grandfather. He's very involved with VMI. George Carter is. And in fact, George Carter, a couple of months ago, gave me this, which is when Tsar Alexander II offered Maury asylum in Russia, the Tsar also sent Commander Maury a pearl diamond brooch for Maury to give to Mrs. Maury as a token of the Tsar's appreciation of Maury's achievements to the world for his science. And George Carter gave me a replica in honor of the work I've been doing on the Pathfinder Papers. The original pearl diamond brooch Tsar Alexander II gave Maury is at the museum at VMI. So, yeah, and I'll show you this. I think the family donated it in, I think, 1958. They said Mrs. Maury wore that thing. She wore it nonstop. She wore it on her bed, in her gown. She loved it. Yeah.
Certainly worthwhile for your speech.
Well, the Fontaine Maury Society is coming here. They voted at their last annual meeting to hold their 2017 annual meeting here in Franklin. So, which was a big deal because they typically like to stay in Virginia or France. But they're coming here to Franklin.
When will that be?
It's going to be October, we just set the date, October 20th and 22nd of 2017. So you'll have Maury's coming from all over the country.
Do you have any idea why, with the option that he had to instruct and teach, but he picked me?
I don't think he wanted to be the president of a university. I think that would be more of an administrative position. He would also have to go north to try to raise a lot of money. Swanee needed a lot of money to get back off they never really got started in the first place. The war interrupted it. And I think he just loved science, and he was very close friends with General Lee. And General Lee was a great mathematician, and so Lee understood Maury in a lot of ways that others didn't.
So he wanted to be near.
That's what a lot of historians think, is he wanted to be near General Lee.
But he didn't have prior connection to VMI before that?
He did. He was friends with Francis Smith, the first superintendent of VMI. They served on the governor's council right when Virginia seceded. Maury and General Smith served together, so he did have that tie. It was close. I think he really was close to accepting the position at University of the South. Bishop Odie was one of his greatest mentors and friends, but I think he didn't want an administrative position. He wanted to get to work on that survey of Virginia to help the people get back on their feet, because Virginia, as you was devastated. Yes.
I believe that I read somewhere that the commander was the one credited with finding the Gulf Stream first. Is that true?
Well, he certainly worked on it. Benjamin Franklin thought it was a reality, but yes, Commander Maury did a lot of research. In fact, I have the 1855 copy of Physical Geography of the Sea over there, and the first sentence of the book is, "There is a river in the ocean." And he's talking about his research on the Gulf Stream. He really fine-tuned the research on the Gulf Stream. And after the talk, you're free to go look at that. It'll give you chills. He was an extraordinary man, and he was nimble with the pen too, which was a double gift.
Have you been to sea?
Have I been to sea?
Yeah.
I have not. I've taken a day trip or two of deep sea fishing, but I have not. I've had many friends ask me that. I'd probably be like Lafayette. They said Lafayette was seasick the whole time. Lafayette hated the sea, but I'd actually love to go to sea. I'd somehow, if I could get on the USNS Maury on one of its cruises, I would love to do that.
Have you been to sea?
2 years. North of that, supposed to.
Any more questions?
Are you writing a book then yourself?
Well, I have the largest collection of his letters in private hands, and my collection now is 1,200, 1,500 letters. And it's of the entire family, which, you got a Reverend James Maury who taught Thomas Jefferson, and you have Abram. I have some of Abram's papers, and Abram's son, A.P. Maury, was a famous congressman here in Tennessee, and with James K. Polk. So I've got a whole lot of work to do. But I have met John Grady, who, as I said, was the former editor of the Navy Times. And Mr. Grady and I have been talking. And
Well, you must have a day job doing something.
I do stocks during the day. I've done that for a long time, just a private investor.
So that you can support your habit of all this.
It's tight at times because the Pathfinder Papers are a labor of love. So I'm not getting paid for it, but I do love it. And someday I want the papers. They'll go to someplace very special. The Tennessee State Museum is well aware of the work I'm doing, and they actually acquired some papers recently of Commander Maury's young cousin, Lieutenant Dabney Minor Scales, who served aboard the CSS Shenandoah, which was another of the British-built Confederate commerce raiders. And I acquired Dabney's 1863 Confederate Secret Service Paris Journal. It's 250 pages Dabney kept in Paris when he was a young spy. He's 22 years old. So they acquired part of that collection, I acquired the other part. So I may help the Tennessee State Museum as they go through their part of
If
their
you
collection.
write like you speak, you got major.
Well-
You know John Mitchell and you all.
Well, I don't know him personally, but I know from his book. He's here in town, so I,
Listen, Franklin,
so.
you need to, wow.
So I've been doing this since, 2011. So, and this is probably my 10th speech. So it's fun. He was an extraordinary man. And again, there's an Academy Award nominated short film that came out in 1940. You can find it online on YouTube. It's called Prophet Without Honor. And it's a verse from the Bible. Jesus said, a prophet is not without honor except in his own home. And it was sort of to show that Matthew Maury was world renowned. He had czars giving him gifts and kings, and Pope Pius IX adored Maury. But back home, he was largely marginalized. And some of that had to do with he sided with the Confederacy. He had a lot of enemies, and that was their chance to try to wipe his memory. So.
But he did save a lot of lives. In terms of decreasing travel time.
Right.
Because there's a limit to how long people can be at sea, how long ships can be at sea.
Right.
And of course it was finding paths made it much safer.
Absolutely. He wrote all the time about discovering the monsters in the waters. In the old sea charts, you'd see the monsters coming out of the waters. Sailors didn't really, they just dead reckoned. They just point the ship where they wanted to go and just kind of pray. If it was an overcast sky, there were no stars to navigate by. But Maury, he really did. He laid it out. And Admiral Sims said he laid it out where even someone not even trained in reading a chart could read Maury's charts. And my friend Howard Cohen at the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, they have a whole collection of Maury's charts, and they're color-coded. And he said a child could figure out how to navigate from those charts. And that was part of his brilliance, because he took some extremely complex things and broke them down into very simple, appearingly simple. His first chart that he did was a compilation of over 100,000 logbooks he'd gone over just to get the path, from New York to San Francisco.
Well, today it's every so many hours they send weather observations. Water temperature, wind direction, wind speed,
Right.
currents, all this stuff. So it's still being assembled and being used.
Right.
And obviously now
You're right.
that's a radio operator.
I bet.
Because even the Russians were saying this and waiting weeks.
Mm-hmm. Oh, wow.
Because they all had stake.
Right.
And of course, that's how you avoid where you don't want to be.
Right. And I know from, just from England, Maury with, what was his name? It was Forbes. His last name was Forbes. They helped design steam routes, coming and going lanes where the steamers would go, where they wouldn't collide. And Maury, in letters I have, he's always concerned of some sailboat coming through there and colliding. And they did have collisions all the time. But he did feel that science, as far as the sea, just with the Brussels conference, it required cooperation with everyone. You couldn't just study a certain part of it. And which that in 1853 was extraordinary, because that was the onset of the Crimean War. And you had both Russia and Great Britain and France there at the Brussels conference. So, and Maury was the one that brought them together. The only thing he couldn't stop was the Civil War, and he tried his best. But that was a beast he couldn't stop.
But do you have anything that he said about his decision to stay with Tennessee? Whatever, when you think about what he did, what the international committee was,
Right.
and then he made this decision
Right.
to follow what some not very distinguished legislators were doing.
Right. He was definitely torn, and I know when he wrote his letter of resignation in the observatory, and he finished his work there every day at 3 o'clock at the observatory. And on April 20th, that was the same day Lee resigned, he worked his full day there at the observatory, and he wrote his letter of resignation at 3 o'clock every day he left at 3 o'clock, and he laid his sword on the desk. He wanted his longtime secretary to write out the letter for him. Commander Maury, as you can see over on those letters, had horrendous handwriting, terrible penmanship. And I've had several historians that have asked me how I can even transcribe his letters. And his longtime secretary told him, "Sir, I can't do what you're about to ask me to do, because your legacy is just going to be destroyed if you join the Confederacy." And so Maury said, give me the pen. And he wrote to Lincoln himself. And they said he was weeping when he left the observatory. So he was definitely, he was conflicted. And he had ideas of reducing slavery that he wanted to implement, and those were quite complex. They were called the safety valve. It involved Brazil, and but it was a complicated time, that's for certain. And Great Britain, they paid dearly for their helping the Confederacy. That problem wasn't solved until 1873 in Geneva, Switzerland, with the Alabama claims. After the war, William Seward, who was friends with Maury, William Seward and Charles Sumner, they went on a campaign against Great Britain and said, y'all owe us reparations for the damages caused by those British-built merchant raiders. And Sumner and Seward wanted Canada as reparations, and Great Britain said, no, I'm not going to give you Canada. And they couldn't come to an agreement, so they held a tribunal in Geneva, Switzerland, called the Alabama Claims. And I think it was 5 judges from independent nations heard the case, and they decided that Great Britain did knowingly help the Confederacy. And they broke the Foreign Enlistment Act. And Great Britain had to pay, I think it was $15 million in reparations. And there's a friend of mine teaches in Geneva, Switzerland, and the room has been preserved. Admiral Sims, one of his swords, hangs on the wall. And the Alabama Claims was the predecessor to the League of Nations and the United Nations. It was the first time a group of nations came together to solve 2 other nations' squabble. But Great Britain and America needed each other, and they made a strong peace after that. And, you know, as I said, Great Britain, that cotton coming in to the textile mills was Amanda Foreman. If y'all have never read her book, World on Fire, it came out a couple of years ago. She wrote the book Duchess. Her father wrote Bridge Over the River Kwai and High Noon. Her father was exiled with the, what was it called, with McCarthyism. So he had to head out to London. They thought High Noon was communist. But she grew up in London, and she wrote this book. And she said there were upwards of 5 million Brits directly dependent on that cotton coming in. And that's why Great Britain. Some historians said during the Civil War you'd be more likely to find Confederate flags flying in Liverpool than you would in Richmond. And it's a pretty unique atmosphere in Liverpool today. They have quite a Confederate flair about them even today in Liverpool. They had a huge sesquicentennial celebration in Liverpool. The Merseyside Maritime Museum had a wonderful exhibit of Admiral Sims' papers, and Css Alabama, and all that. It was interesting. Stuff you don't usually think about. So, well, I hope everybody had a good time. All right.
You did an outstanding job.
Well, thank you, sir.
Outstanding.
Thank you. Thank you.
Wonderful.